As we approach the 75th birthday of the State of Israel, it is evident that Zionists have long ago accomplished the original ideological goal of Zionism, the reestablishment of a nation for the Jewish people, who wandered in exile for nearly 2,000 years. By the late 1940s, it was clear British ambitions to rule the Palestinian Mandate were a failure. After taking over and dividing up the remnants of the Ottoman Empire amongst themselves and the French, the British were unable to maintain order, curb bloodshed, and generally mediate tensions between the Jewish settlers and the Arab inhabitants of Palestine. A brief aside here. I refer to the Jews as settlers because the Jews of the first and second Aliyah, those outside the old Yeshuv, were colonists in Palestine. However, it was also clear that the Jews were absolutely not colonists in the, quote, usual sense of sons or agents of an imperial mother country projecting its power beyond the seas and exploiting, end quote, the resources of the global south. This distinction was made clear by Musa al-Alami, head of the Palestinian Arab propaganda agency known as the Arab Office, in a 3-volume survey entitled The Problem of Palestine. The survey addressed to the Anglo-American Committee cautioned against depicting, quote, Jewish colonization in Palestine and Arab resistance to it in the terms of white colonization of North America and Australia and the resistance of indigenous peoples, end quote. Jews of the first and second Aliyah were predominantly pioneers from Europe, yet they were not replicating any system of imperialism and represented no nation until 1948. The majority of settlers were predominantly poor, seeking refugee and asylum foremost. Some came to Palestine with Zionist ambitions, but the average Jewish settler was far removed from the inner workings of the Zionist organization. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, political Zionism started within the circles of the cosmopolitan Jewish aristocracy and diaspora, and was then disseminated to the larger population across Europe, North Africa, Western Asia, and of course the United States. Zionism was indeed a top-down initiative. The ideological battle over hearts and minds that the Zionist political elite wished to dominate would occur after sufficient immigration in the years preceding independence. It took decades to grow the labor Zionist movement into something even resembling a genuine grassroots mobilization. Now back to the UN. The United Nations devised their partition plan for Palestine, i.e., UN Resolution 181, in 1947. UN Resolution 181, expanding on the precedent of the British Peel Commission, supported the division of British Mandatory Palestine into 2 states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs. The UN plan provided the blueprint, and after the declaration of Israeli independence in 1948, the Jews became a quote-unquote people with a nation nearly overnight. Ben-Gurion accomplished this despite pretty much unilateral Arab rejection of the partition plan and intransigence towards the idea of establishing any Jewish state in Palestine. The stubborn resistance of the Arabs was not unexpected by the Zionist elite. Let us be clear that the architects of the Yeshuv and the future Israeli political elite, represented by Ben-Gurion, explicitly sought to establish a quote-unquote Medina Irvit, a Jewish state, in place of the Yeshuv, and knew that doing so would bring the Jews into direct conflict with Arab nationalist aspirations in the region. Ben-Gurion was explicit about the conflicting desires between the Arab and Jewish national movements in Palestine. Quote, there is a fundamental conflict. We and they want the same thing. We both want Palestine. By our very presence and progress here, we have nurtured the Arab movement. End quote. It's clear Ben-Gurion did not see the Jewish nationalist movement as capable of encompassing the Arab population of Palestine. This is suggestive of the belief among Zionists, which dates back to the days of Herzl, that some transference or expulsion of Palestine's Arab population was a necessary precursor to establishing a Jewish state in the region. Ben-Gurion wrote in a letter to his son that, quote, we never wanted to dispossess the Arabs, but since England is giving part of the country promised to us, for an Arab state, it is only fair that the Arabs in our state be transferred to the Arab area, end quote. Ben-Gurion's successor to the prime ministership, Sharet, spoke in a similar vein, quote, fear is the main factor in all Palestinian Arab politics. There is no Arab who is not harmed by the Jews' entry into the country, end quote. The Zionists clearly understood the existential threat Jewish immigration posed to the Arab majority, and an explicit goal of Zionism was to remove as many Arabs as possible from the future Jewish state, as Israel would not be a place that extended rights to non-Jewish inhabitants. Likewise, In the decades before independence, Jewish political leaders were busy constructing an Arab boogeyman to fit their narrative of Jewish history. They knew it was only a matter of time before the natives began to violently resist Jewish settlement. For example, after the Arab Revolt, which tore the region from the relative calm of the 1920s and shocked the Yishuv, began in 1936, Soviet-born, future Israeli president, and leader of the Zionist organization, Chaim Weizmann, put it bluntly. Quote, "On one side, the forces of destruction, the forces of the desert, have risen, and on the other side stand firm the forces of civilization and building. It is the old war of the desert against civilization, but we will not be stopped." End quote. This dehumanizing narrative of Arabs as just part of the desert, scenery, on the margins, and savages in opposition to Western civilization was not uncommon amongst Zionist intellectuals in the first half of the 20th century. We see this legacy in Israeli politics today, particularly in the rhetoric weaponized by the Israeli right, many of whom are the ideological descendants of Zev Jabotinsky's revisionist Zionism. Indeed, this reflected a fragment of the European colonial mindset buried within Ashkenazi Jews, particularly amongst polished Zionist intellectuals. Furthermore, an ideologue of the kibbutz movement, Yitzhak Tabenkin, went as far as invoking the crimes of the Nazis to demonize the Arabs. Quote, "The swastika waved aloft in Hitler's Germany, and the green flag, the Arab national flag, now upraised by the reactionary leadership of Palestine. They are the same flag, the flag of natural hatred." End quote. Morris says of the tendency to relate Arab violence with anti-Semitism in Europe, quote, "Many of the new Olim, immigrants on Aliyah, instantly translated their Russian experiences into Palestinian coinage. Arab was equated with Gentile, Arab marauding with pogrom, local antagonism and territorial feuding with anti-Semitism." Moreover, Ben-Gurion was acutely aware of Arab sentiments towards Jewish settlers. Quote, "Were I an Arab, I would rise up against immigration liable sometime in the future to hand the country over to Jewish rule. What Arab cannot do his math and understand that immigration at the rate of 60,000 a year means a Jewish state in all of Palestine?" End quote. The situation on the ground in Palestine differed from the picture portrayed by the Jewish Agency to Europe's Jews. Many settlers expected to arrive in a distant, desolate land lacking inhabitants. This was far from the truth. Although not the indigenous population of a land untouched by Western civilization, the Arabs, overwhelmingly followers of Islam, lived in the region for close to a millennium before serious Jewish immigration is started. The Zionist slogan, quote, "A land without a people for a people without a land," end quote, was clever propaganda, but utterly devoid of attachment to reality. While support for a 21st century Zionism, maintaining the security of Israeli territory, both legitimate and occupied, and the Jewish population who lives there, is strong throughout the diaspora today, particularly amongst liberal American Jews. This was not always the case. At the time of independence, world Jewry did not know whether self-determination would remedy the so-called Jewish problem, the plague of being a permanent religious minority, persecuted ruthlessly in Europe, and to a lesser but still significant degree in North Africa, Arabia, and the Levant. Prevalent amongst the German Jewish intelligentsia in the first half of the 20th century was a strain of emancipationist anti-Zionism, see Hannah Arendt and Martin Buber, that pushed for greater assimilation of Jews into Gentile society. Buber's charisma and intellectual prowess made him a leader amongst the German Jewish students of Hebrew University, with whom he gained a respectful following. Once a follower turned a critic of Herzl, Buber was concerned with the substance of the Jewish soul, an elemental Jewish nature. After Herzl's death, Buber said of Herzl in a letter to Paula Winkler Buber, quote, "He laid his hand on it, i.e. Zionism, with a firm, shaping pressure. How many noble possibilities were killed?" End quote. And likewise, quote, "It is fundamentally false to celebrate him as a Jewish personality, as one could celebrate Spinoza, Israel Baal Shem, Heinrich Heine, or Ferdinand Lassalle." End quote. These cultured and cosmopolitan Jews, Herzl and Buber were both of these things, whom no doubt to some degree resented the poor, illiterate Jewish masses that struggled to shed their backward ways, rejected the notion of a nation of the Jews outright. Like Buber, Many of the quote-unquote civilized Jews from Europe's big cities saw the ethical quandary of statehood, the monopoly on violence the state could choose to wield, the corrupting lure of power, and the encroachment of political bureaucracy on religious law and practice as stains tarnishing their pure, sacred, and idealistic conceptions of Judaism. On the other hand, in the wake of the Shoah and operating in the world of realpolitik, Mapai, Mifleget Polei Eretz Yisrael, the Land of Israel Workers' Party, the predecessor to the Labor Party, led first by old Soviet-born ideologues like Ben-Gurion and Sharet, and later by Meir, Peres, and Rabin, acted with a sense of urgency. These pragmatic bureaucrats who comprised the socialist establishment were ready to dirty their hands crafting policy. Mapai, generating its power through the Histadrut, transformed Zionism from a fledgling campaign to achieve statehood into the guiding ideology of the new state responsible for the welfare of hundreds of thousands of Jews, tying the once revolutionary Zionism to organized labor, and thus the material conditions of Jewish settlers, made Zionism appealing to workers. After 1948, as labor Zionism grew in popularity, the meaning of Zionist began to mutate, changing to become more abstract. Now, a Zionist did not just support the material and spiritual well-being of the Jews in Palestine, but the state of Israel's existence, from its perception abroad down to the very soil beneath the Jews' feet. As a potential solution to the Jewish problem, being a Zionist was still essentially a remedy to an existential crisis. The Arabs initially wished to wipe away the Zionist presence in Palestine and quote-unquote Jewish influence from the region. To many Jews, only Zionism stood between them and the Mediterranean Sea. This was true for the expansionist revisionists on the right, who dominated the opposition in the early decades of statehood, and the Land for Peace socialists who formed the labor establishment. Support for Jewish self-determination meant holding on to what the Jews had gained at all costs, protecting the bastion of European Enlightenment thought, the island of democratic rule, within the surrounding sea of authoritarian Arab aggression. Fundamentally, Zionism was still concerned with the health of Jewish society in Palestine, but now that meant establishing and ensuring the security and development of Israel, an actual land with internationally recognized borders. The connection between Zionism and the physical land should not be overlooked. Over decades, Zionism manufactured in the Jewish population of Palestine and American Jews a strong sense of ahavat haaretz. This is a Hebrew phrase with a precise connotation meaning, quote, love of the land of Israel, end quote, or, quote, love of the land of the Jewish people, end quote. The absorption of this truism into the Jewish psyche culminated in 2018 with the passing of the Nation-State Bill, a new basic law, which formally declared what most had known for a century. Israel was to be the nation-state of the Jewish people. Buber's legacy is evident throughout Israeli academia, specifically at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. For example, in the 1980s, working with newly declassified materials from the First Arab-Israeli War in 1947 to 1949, the quote-unquote new historians, C. Benny Morris, Avi Shlaim, and Sima Flapan, amongst others, made significant contributions to Israeli historiography, calling the mainstream Zionist narrative of the history of the Jews in Palestine into question. They often rejected the label of anti-Zionist, but remained highly skeptical of the Zionist project and nation-building more generally. The new historians did not align themselves clearly with either the mainstream Israeli left or right. Both Labor and Likud subscribed to the Zionist orthodoxy. The new historians began by challenging the traditional Zionist consensus surrounding the First Arab-Israeli War using the newly declassified material. They aimed to trouble the history of the First Arab-Israeli War as a revolutionary war of independence, in which a timid and defenseless Israeli David resisted the aggression of an Arab Goliath. The new historians, some better than others, avoided polemicism, tending to instead present a view of the First Arab-Israeli War in a more objective light, avoiding ideological dogma and relying heavily on Israeli primary sources. Their history was decisively not Zionist, but simultaneously not anti-Zionist. Digging into the archives, they began constructing a more nuanced understanding of the war. What is generally considered one war of independence was really, even from a cursory glass, two separate conflicts: a civil war between the Israelis and Palestinian Arabs, followed by a full-scale conventional war that erupted after the neighboring Arab armies invaded. The Arabs posed a genuine threat, but as the new historians would come to argue, they were no Goliath. Arab society, from the Fayahin to the Effendis, was riddled with internal divisions. This was evident in the inter-clan conflict, tribal squabbles, and the overall lack of coordination between the invading Arab nations who were constantly jockeying for power. The Arabs had superiority of numbers, but outside of the Jordanian Arab Legion, the Arab troops lacked formal training, were generally unprepared for combat, and relied heavily on aging Soviet technology. Likewise, the Israelis were no David. The Haganah, which was absorbed into the Israeli Defense Force during the war in 1948, was a well-organized army toting modernized weaponry. Moreover, the IDF did not fight a purely defensive war, and in fact, their operations were guided by the understanding that as many Arabs living in the territory of the Jewish state should be expelled as possible. The flight of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs from inside Israel was not a spontaneous event and cannot be entirely explained by the decisions and rhetoric of Arab leaders. The right-wing paramilitary groups like Irgun Zvi and Lehi often operated outside the jurisdiction of the IDF, which manifested in massacres of Palestinian Arabs, like at Deir Yassin. News of a massacre would spread throughout the countryside, prompting others to flee their villages for their lives. The exodus wasn't limited to rural areas, however. Tens of thousands would leave Arab population centers in cities like Haifa and Jaffa. Simply acknowledging these historical truths, the displacement of Palestinian Arabs, the IDF's role in the matter, terrorist activity from the IZL and Lehi, and the lack of accountability these groups faced from the IDF, were taboo in Israeli society. Amongst Israeli intellectuals, there have always been critics of Zionism, dating back to Buber and the original students and faculty at Hebrew University. But the new historians truly reignited this tradition with their criticisms. There was a significant shift in Israeli historiography following this scholarship. By the mid-1990s, this had inspired Jewish academics in Israel and the diaspora to theorize Zionism differently and imagine alternative futures to Israeli statehood. Considering the reality of the quote-unquote Israeli War of Independence in the wake of the findings brought to the surface by the new historians, and the fact that the original goals of Zionism were accomplished politically and militarily through this war, talk of the beginning of a post-Zionist era began to gain footing inside these intellectual circles. Imagining an Israel after Zionism became fashionable amongst academics. Many were curious about living in an age where Zionism no longer resembled its original self. What did such a reality imply for the Jews, both in Israel and in the diaspora? What could it mean for Israel's non-Jewish citizens? Is an Israel after Judaism a realistic possibility? If so, what can we imagine a post-Jewish Israel to resemble? For the past 3 decades, even as Likud dominates the political arena, expanding settlements in the West Bank, intellectuals and academics have agitated to dismantle the Jewish state in favor of some multi-ethnic democracy. The nation-state bill was passed just 3 years ago, and settlement activity is continuing to grow. Yet today, more Israelis than ever are beginning to imagine what an Israel with one system for all of its inhabitants could look like. But this kind of democracy seems impossible to reconcile with the brutal quotidian reality of the military occupation. To conclude, I will leave you with some questions. How could Israel move away from the apartheid-like rule in the West Bank and Gaza and absorb the Israeli Arab minority who live within the Green Line into their politics? What does the single, multi-ethnic state miss or get wrong? Is this even something politically or judicially achievable? What does a return of Palestinian Arabs to the land even look like? Is restitution really possible? How will Israel adapt to the 21st century? Will they double down on military rule as much of the Arab world turns their backs on Palestinians? Or will they change course to affirm their legitimacy as a champion of democracy in the region?